Why are so many Gen X men becoming sugar daddies? Most people will give the lazy answer: money, sex, and ego. But the brutal truth is much darker. For a lot of these men, this isn't just about desire, it's about aging, loneliness, emotional disconnection, and the fear of becoming irrelevant. And if that sounds dramatic, stay with me, because this story is not really about older men spending money on younger women. It's about what happens when an entire generation is taught to measure its value by control, toughness, and success, and then wakes up one day realizing none of those things can protect it from getting older. That's the part nobody wants to say out loud, because once you strip away the glamour, the performance, and the fantasy, what you often find underneath is not confidence, it's panic. Gen X men grew up in a very specific emotional climate. They were told to be hard, self-reliant, quiet, and useful. Don't complain, don't overshare, don't be needy, don't fall apart. If you were a boy coming of age in that era, you learned very quickly that vulnerability was dangerous, tenderness was suspicious, and asking for emotional reassurance made you weak. So a lot of men got good at performing stability without ever actually building it. They learned how to work, how to provide, how to joke, how to suppress, how to survive. But they never really learned how to process shame, loneliness, rejection, or the quiet terror of feeling unseen. And that matters because all of those buried emotions have a way of resurfacing later, especially when youth starts fading and life stops validating you automatically. That's where the real tension begins. In youth, a man can hide behind momentum. He can distract himself with work, relationships, marriage, ambition, nightlife, fatherhood, routine. He can tell himself he's fine because he's moving. But middle age is brutal because it slows everything down just enough for the silence to get loud. Careers plateau, marriages break, bodies change, desire shifts, social circles shrink, children grow up and leave, the mirror becomes less forgiving, and suddenly a man who spent decades being needed can find himself in a deeply unfamiliar place, still alive, still functioning, still outwardly respectable, but internally replaceable. That word is poison to the male ego, replaceable. Because for many men, especially those raised to equate worth with utility, irrelevance feels like a kind of death. And here's the first uncomfortable hook in this story. A sugar relationship can feel like a shortcut around that death. Not because it solves anything real, but because it temporarily removes the most painful part of aging, the possibility that no one chooses you unless you pay for the terms. That's what makes this subject so dark. A lot of people see the older man in that arrangement and assume he feels powerful. Sometimes he does. But power is often the costume desperation wears when it wants to look dignified. What looks like confidence from the outside can actually be a man trying to buy relief from invisibility. He's not just purchasing access, he's purchasing a feeling, the feeling that he still matters, the feeling that he can still attract, the feeling that time hasn't taken everything yet. And no, this is not about saying every older man in these relationships is broken, manipulative, or pathetic. That would be too easy, and lazy thinking is exactly what keeps people from understanding what's really happening. The darker truth is more complicated than moral outrage. Many of these men are not cartoon villains. They are emotionally underdeveloped adults with money, loneliness, unresolved grief, and nowhere socially acceptable to put any of it. They have learned how to pay bills, how to maintain appearances, how to carry conversations, maybe even how to seem charming, but not how to sit with emptiness without trying to anesthetize it. So when they discover a system where attention can be negotiated, expectations can be defined, and rejection can be softened by money, it feels safer than traditional intimacy. That's the trap. The arrangement feels cleaner than vulnerability. Because real intimacy is risky. Real intimacy requires exposure. It requires honesty without guarantees. It asks a person to be known before being desired. And for a lot of Gen X men, that is far more frightening than spending money. Money is easy. Money is legible. Money is familiar. Money lets a man stay in the one language he's been rewarded for his entire life: provision. If he can provide, then maybe he doesn't have to fully reveal himself. If he can offer lifestyle, gifts, rent, experiences, then maybe he can bypass the humiliating parts of modern dating: the uncertainty, the emotional negotiation, the possibility of being seen as ordinary. That matters. more than people realize, because for men who built identity around competence, ordinary feels unbearable. Now add modern culture to this equation, and the entire thing becomes even more combustible. We live in an attention economy where youth is algorithmically amplified, beauty is monetized in real time, and status is constantly measured in public. Every day, men in midlife are bombarded with reminders of what they are losing. Their desirability is no longer assumed. Their authority no longer impresses like it once did. Their age, instead of being a symbol of respect, is often treated like a warning label unless it comes packaged with money, charisma, or exceptional looks. So what happens when a man who was never taught emotional adaptability enters a culture that worships novelty? He panics in ways that don't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like self-improvement. Sometimes it looks like gym obsession. Sometimes it looks like divorce. And sometimes it looks like becoming a sugar daddy. But here is where the story gets even more brutal. Many of these men are not only chasing youth, they are chasing asymmetry. That distinction matters. Youth is part of the fantasy, yes, but so is the structure itself. In a conventional relationship, both people bring expectations, standards, disappointments, emotional needs, and power. In a transactional dynamic, those variables are often simplified. Money can reduce uncertainty, it can flatten negotiation, it can create an environment where admiration feels more available and resistance feels less likely. For a man exhausted by the complexity of equal intimacy, that structure can feel intoxicating, not because it is healthy, but because it is manageable. He doesn't just want affection. He wants clarity. He wants predictability. He wants to avoid the unbearable possibility of being emotionally evaluated and found lacking. And if that sounds cold, ask yourself why that kind of arrangement would feel more manageable than dating someone as an equal. The answer is not flattering. It suggests a deep fragility hiding underneath the performance of masculine control. A lot of these men are not escaping women. They are escaping exposure. They don't want to be asked who they really are now that the old identities are collapsing. Not just provider, not just husband, not just father, not just executive, not just the funny guy, the reliable guy, the guy who keeps it together. Who are you when those roles stop protecting you from yourself? That is the question middle-age forces, and plenty of people spend thousands of dollars trying not to answer it. The irony is vicious. The very generation of men taught to avoid emotional dependence can become intensely dependent on transactional validation. They may call it freedom. They may call it realism. They may say traditional relationships are too complicated, that modern women ask too much, that everyone is using everyone anyway. But listen closely and you'll often hear something else beneath the cynicism. Exhaustion, resentment, disappointment, fear. Fear that they are no longer enough as they are. Fear that genuine attraction has expired. Fear that if money is removed from the equation, interest disappears with it. That fear can become addictive, because once a man starts using money to stabilize his self-worth, every interaction becomes both soothing and corrosive at the same time. He feels wanted, but he also knows the terms, that knowledge never fully goes away. And that's why this lifestyle can be more psychologically devastating than it appears. The fantasy promises relief, but it often deepens the wound it was meant to cover. A man enters the arrangement to feel less invisible, but over time he may become even more haunted by the question of what is real. Is she laughing because I'm funny? Or because I'm useful? Does she desire me, or the version of life I can temporarily create? Would anyone choose me without the accessories? Those doubts can rot a person from the inside because they convert every moment of pleasure into a test he can never fully pass. The arrangement offers control, but not peace. It offers stimulation, but not restoration. It offers attention, but not necessarily attachment. And for someone already starved for authentic connection, that can become a brutal cycle. Spend, feel elevated, crash, repeat. Now here's the part a lot of viewers won't expect. This is not just a story about men failing. It's also a story about a culture that gives men almost no graceful script for aging. Women face brutal pressures around age, obviously, but men are sold a different lie. They are told aging can be defeated if they stay rich enough, fit enough, cool enough, sexual enough, dominant enough. The message is not grow into deeper humanity. The message is maintain market value. So instead of developing emotional range, many men double down on optics. Instead of mourning lost youth, they perform access to it. Instead of building intimacy, they curate proof that they still have options. And if they have money, they can outsource the illusion. That's not liberation. That's a monetized identity crisis. What makes Gen X especially vulnerable is that they sit in a strange historical gap. They were raised with old-school emotional rules, but they are aging inside a hyper-modern social marketplace. They didn't grow up learning the language of emotional literacy, therapy culture, attachment styles, or public vulnerability the way younger generations often do, but they are now competing inside a world shaped by all of those things, whether they understand them or not. So some of them feel disoriented, resentful, and left behind. They may look at modern dating and experience it less as a challenge than as a referendum on everything they were taught to be. Suddenly the stoicism that once seemed masculine feels distant. The provider identity feels less impressive. The emotional reserve that once signaled strength now reads as unavailability. And instead of adapting inwardly, some men adapt transactionally. That's why the phrase midlife crisis is actually too weak for what's happening here. A crisis sounds temporary. This is often existential. It is a collision between aging and identity, desire and mortality, money and meaning. It is a man confronting the possibility that he spent decades building a version of masculinity that can acquire things but cannot comfort him. That is devastating, because once the distractions stop working, he is left alone with a question he may have avoided his whole life. If I am not admired, not desired on command, not central, not needed in the old ways, who am I? Some answer that question by growing, others answer it by numbing, others by chasing proof, and some by entering arrangements that let them feel selected without ever having to risk being truly known. So when people reduce this phenomenon to older men being creepy, they miss the deeper story. And when people reduce it to guys just wanting fun, they miss it too. The more unsettling truth is that for many Gen X men, becoming a sugar daddy is less about pleasure than about emotional architecture. It is a system that lets them convert money into reassurance, status into intimacy theater, and structure into a substitute for vulnerability. It may look glamorous, edgy, or shamelessly transactional, but beneath that surface is often something much sadder. A man trying to negotiate with time, loneliness, and diminishing certainty using the one tool he still trusts. And maybe that's the darkest part of all. Not that these men want younger women, not that they have money to spend, not even that desire can be commercialized. The darkest part is that many of them may have reached the second half of life without ever learning how to be loved outside of what they can provide. Think about how tragic that is, to have lived long enough to accumulate resources, stories, scars, and experience and still not know whether your presence alone is enough. That kind of uncertainty doesn't just create bad decisions. It creates entire lifestyles built around avoiding the truth. So if this trend keeps growing, don't just ask what men are buying. Ask what they're starving for. Ask what kind of culture produces men who can fund fantasy more easily than they can sustain intimacy. Ask what happens when aging collides with emotional illiteracy in a world that monetizes insecurity. Because once you ask those questions, the sugar daddy conversation stops being gossip and starts looking like a mirror. Not just for Gen X men, but for a society that taught millions of people to chase validation instead of connection, performance instead of presence, leverage instead of love. And that is the brutal truth. Not that these men are simply indulging themselves, but that many of them are trying to outrun irrelevance through transaction and discovering, too late, that attention can be rented but belonging cannot.